Alright, so in the last month, we've had two different sources of data that have kind of grabbed the attention of the community, well, one more so than the other. But I want to talk about them both because they're both in a similar vein as something I've been meaning to talk about once again, which, it's tier list. You know, we're 4 months into 2024 and I really haven't made a video talking about tier lists, and that's, you know, as a content creator, that's kind of sus. Everybody loves tier lists, everybody talks about them. Like, it's at this point where people kind of have a quote on that shit. But my thing is, I think tier list data, they're cool, they're good information, I think they're interesting, but I don't think they should be something that you decide your choices on, especially in a game like Lost Ark. There is an argument for competitive games where that could be a thing. Like if you're playing Tekken and two players are at the exact same skill level, the character with the better damage, the better frame data, that's going to give them the advantage, that's going to give them the edge. But because this is an MMO, this is a game with gear, there are a lot more things to consider besides player and character ceiling. And the fact that this is a PvE game as opposed to a PvP game, well, there's PvP, but nobody really cares about it. But it changes the whole dynamic because there is no matchup. So the first one is pretty simple. It's not something we're going to spend a lot of time on because it's very basic and very to the point. This is a damage tier list on the rawest of forms. This is just showing how much damage these characters can do in a Trixian parse. So this is just every engraving's damage ceiling, and nothing is really too surprising. Most of everything is where most people would expect, but you have to remember this is like a 2-minute vacuum, perfect uptime, everything. These are ceilings and not really practical. And I think that's really all that needs to be said about this, because we're going to get into all these kind of details into the next one, which is the more prevalent topic, which is the Lost Ark DPS visualization. So if you don't know, which you probably do because you probably watch other Lost Ark creators and everybody's already made a video on this, there is now a log website where people upload their logs, and there are thousands and thousands of logs. So since people have access to all this information now, people have decided to put these all together and compare them. But to put it in these visualizations to help really make this more digestible than just looking through a bunch of logs. And I think what's really interesting about this situation is this is like really the first time that a lot of KR people are looking to NA for information. Now, I could be wrong about that, but my first exposure to this was an Inven post that was showing them looking at our logs to put together a graph similar to this. Because in KR, it is a very bannable offense. Using meter over there is not allowed, while over here in the West, it's kind of the Wild West. We don't talk about it, and people generally don't seem to get banned for it, but so it's just kind of a don't ask, don't tell situation. So this is all data and parses from the West. So if we take a look, there is the fight and the item level up on top, and then on the left side is every engraving. The number beside it is the amount of parses that it was able to draw that data from. Since this is just taking data off the logs, there isn't like a set number for each one. They didn't limit it, or they didn't try to get a certain bare minimum. This is just, hey, we had this many logs, here's all the data. And also in this data, they did disregard multiple parses from the same person on the same fight. I'm pretty sure they said that somewhere. So there is a whole lot of data to unpack and extract from all this. It is super interesting to me because this is actual real data. Because the thing is, the reason why I don't like making tier lists, and the reason why I always say to take other people's tier lists with a grain of salt, no one person knows absolutely everything about every class, and they've played with every class a ton. I think there are a lot of people with really good experience with a lot of classes, and they've played the latest raid with a lot of different classes, but even in that scenario, you're getting a very small sample of the entire player base. And even with these logs, not everybody runs log. This is still a small sample in the grand scheme, but it is still a much larger sample that we've had than anything else. So what I like here is that there are no opinions, and this is just pure raw data. And the thing is, if you do keep up with a lot of what people say about the meta, what's high and low, it checks out. When you look at recent tier lists, you're going to see things roughly similar to where you're seeing them now. It's not hot news that DB, Soul Eater, Reaper, those are really good classes. Meanwhile, classes like Pistolier have a very low ceiling. Meanwhile, CO is pretty to spare in most fights, but in the fights that it does good, it's fucking jacked. But I think in general, these actually line up decently well with a lot of tier lists, and even with that KR damage list. Then you can also see how the difficulty of the raids kind of affect damage as well. Because if we look at Volt as normal, Barrage is suddenly up there on top because they're able to just sit in their wheelchair all the time. Now the white lines, the ranges, now there is quite a bit of difference between them, and I think there's a lot of good reason because of that. Because again, you got to remember, this is only separating them by what engraving they play and also the item level. Gear, synergy, support diff, those are very big things. And another thing that goes really unconsidered, which I might talk about this more in another video eventually, is the length of the fight. Some classes perform better in short fights and some perform better in long fights. And you can kind of take the range and outliers as similar to a topic I've talked about before, which is the floor and ceilings of classes. And a lot of these classes that are perceived as strong have a very big range. And by design, that's not really a bad thing because if you consider risk and reward, but since that is not consistent across the board, I still don't think that's by design and they just kind of happen to be this way. Now, they actually do have hell mode data, which I think is really interesting to look at in contrast. With hell mode data, we are getting rid of all the variance when it comes to gearing. There's still going to be a variance as far as party synergy goes and along with support diff. But in the grand scheme of Lost Ark, hell mode is a very niche community because it doesn't really benefit people that much. It's people who do it for the challenge. These are people who are much more serious about things or people who just want to buy and sell roses. But with this data, you are getting rid of the gear gap and then also you are greatly reducing the skill gap, or more accurately, the skill variance. Because again, these are the people who are going to be hardcore sweating out every run, every attempt, trying to just pump the best they can. And when you're looking over this, it does kind of reflect that as well. The range is smaller and you don't really see that many outliers. But again, there is less of a sample size to go off. But even then, like classes that have over 1,000 parses or something like that, there still aren't that many outliers. Which we should probably talk about those outliers now. Let's be honest now, we have a lot of fucking goblins in this game. Main character syndrome off the fucking charts. These are the people who look at these lists. They look at they see that dot all the way off like 3 screens away, like a Marth grab in Melee, and they're like, yeah, I can be that guy. That's me right there. They're called an outlier for a reason. You're probably not that guy. And I'm not saying this to like demotivate people and say that, you know, don't even try. I'm saying this because a lot of people have to get off their high horse and actually be realistic. And to become a great player is going to be a process. It's not something that you are just naturally just the greatest at. How I've learned to really accept and understand tier list really comes from my experience with fighting games. It's a much more simple environment there where it's just player ceiling and character ceiling. People love to blame their loss on the character itself because they claim that they're hitting the ceiling on the character and they need to upgrade to a better character because the character is holding them back. But chances are their game knowledge isn't that great, their execution might not be off, they might be eating the same mix-ups all the time over and over and over. A character might have a way to cheese out of one of those things, but it's not going to fix you as a player. Which loops back to the start of the video where I said that there is a time where tier lists do matter and tiers do matter, and it's when players are at the same skill level and the character is actually going to make the difference. But there are caveats to all these types of arguments, as in fighting games, playing a low tier gives you an advantage to some degree as you're playing a character not many people play generally, and so people don't know the matchup that well, they don't know the frame data that well, and they have a harder time fighting you as opposed to something that is in the meta. But now I'm kind of ranting too much about fighting games. But there is also an argument that there is a value in tier list when it comes to if there was a tier list on how easy it is to get to the ceiling. But to a degree, we can kind of see that now if we look at the visualization and see the ranges. Now, obviously, yes, there are going to be some limitations. Like some classes literally just can't do that much damage because of what you see in Trixion, which they can do on their best situation. They can only hit a certain amount of damage. That is absolutely true. But for a lot of people, that's just not really going to matter. And you have to remember, this is a live service game that's getting constantly patched, updated, and getting new raids. Character balance patches alone are going to change a huge part of the game, and they are trying to balance patch more often, and on top of it, there's also going to be new raids. Because something I haven't talked about yet is if we look at this visualization, we can see that these classes definitely perform very different depending on the fight itself. Baldur's Gate 2, Hound like how these affect how you play your character greatly changes how these tier lists work. Movement on bosses, how fast they move, is going to be a big factor of it. As tier 3 goes on, they had to keep on making the game harder, and one of the things they keep on doing is kind of making the bosses move transition, having more patterns, more constant patterns, and this drastically changes how DPS interact with the fight. When Igniter was kind of at its peak to being talked to about as like the greatest class in the game out there with Surge, a big content in the game at that time was Clown. This is a fight where he didn't really move around too much and he had a lot of long patterns. He had a couple staggers onto it. Very big windows for somebody to just drop all their damage. Or in this case of the sorcerers, they are able to drop their double meatball perfectly fine many times in the fight and just push it up to the next phase. Now there are fights like Kyango G1 where that doesn't really happen. There's not too many times where you can just easily get all your damage windows in all the time. You'd rather just kind of jump off at that point. And with that, I think I've pretty much covered everything I kind of wanted to talk about in this video. To sum it up, I think this data is really good. It helps you really show a realistic showing of the classes and how they're performing. It also gives a little insight on how they're balancing things a little bit to some degree. Like, people outcry about Gunslinger all the time and how it's doing low damage, but Peacemaker is never really at the bottom end of all of these things. They're pretty middle. But it also makes you wonder why some of these classes at the way bottom are not anywhere else. But maybe that's a little despair for me since I really love Pistolier. But I really just wanted to talk about all this information and also just talk about how it should affect you and how you should take it, in my opinion. I still firmly believe that you should pick characters and classes that fit your playstyle and that you enjoy playing before a tier list is even a thing. If you work hard enough at it, you play the class and you really enjoy it, you might become the outlier that somebody else looks at and is like, hey, I can be that guy too.